First, before we get started, it's um, it's a challenging time in the world and for each of us in our own way personally. So I just want to give everybody a moment to sit comfortably in your chair, uh, take a deep breath. If there's like that thought in your head or that feeling that you have that you just want to address before you open yourself up for some study of Torah, take a moment for a little extra kavanah, a little extra focus today for us to get ready to learn. Okay. I guess on a related note, Jews have been reading the Torah on an annual cycle for millennia, and part of that comes the ritual of studying the weekly portion during the week, and in some ways it's an anchor for us. And if you've been doing it your whole life, it's a real anchor, and if you're new to it, it's becoming an anchor. We do it at happy times and at sad times, and at times when what's in the parsha connects to what's in the world, and at times when what's in the parsha is not connected to what's in the world. And there's something for me, anyways, that's comforting about turning to the parsha each week, whatever it is, whatever's going on, and spending a little time dedicated to it. So I really appreciate that you're here to join all of us and join me for this week. And with those opening thoughts, we'll get started. As Mara suggested, but there's a lot of narrative in this parsha. I'm thinking about as we're moving through the book of Genesis of Sefer Bereshit. Many formative narratives many narratives that are an important part of the story of the Torah happen in Genesis, right? As we know, because we just experienced it before the holidays, but it's coming again later in the year. There are many legal sections and other passages that have material that's interesting to study, but the beginning of the Torah is front-loaded with stories. And sometimes I wish it took us, there were double the number of parshiot in Genesis and longer portions of the week later on, so that we could have more time to deep dive into all these stories each week. But I couldn't. So one, I couldn't in the time we have make space to deal with everything that's important that happens in the parsha. But I felt like I couldn't just say today we're going to focus on this without looking at the whole. So as practice I've learned from, I guess, podcasts that cover television shows. At the beginning of those podcasts, people say, here's a summary of today's episode. So here's a summary of today's parsha. So we hear the whole view, and then we're going to dig into a particular aspect of it. So these are really quick bullet points, and I'm drawing from Dvash, which is a weekly Parshat Shavua study guide from Hadar, which is a New York institution for study that they have lots of resources. You could look them up online. This is their summary of this week's Parsha, Vayera. 1, Abraham sits outside his tent on a very hot day and sees 3 figures in the distance and runs out to invite them over for food and drinks. 2, the guests are actually angels, and they tell Avraham and Sarah that Yitzchak will be born in the coming year. 3, God tells Avraham that Sodom is going to be destroyed because of the people's horrible behavior there. Avraham pleads on Sodom's behalf, but there are not enough righteous people in the city to save it. 4, Lot, his wife, and 2 daughters run away from Sodom while it's being destroyed by fire from the sky. His wife turns back to look and becomes a pillar of salt. 5, Yitzchak is born while Sarah is 90 and Avraham is 100. 6, Sarah sends Yishmael away with his mother Hagar. And lastly, God tests Abraham, commanding him to offer Yitzchak as a sacrifice. They travel for 3 days to the mountain of God that God shows Abraham. An angel calls to Abraham at the last second telling Avraham not to harm Yitzhak at all. And just then he sees a ram caught in the bush by its horns. A ram is offered in place of Yitzhak. This story, of course, is called Akedat Yitzhak. And if that sounds familiar to you, many of the readings of the Torah on Rosh Hashanah all come from this parsha. And if you're a regular attendee of this session, it happens. I was with you last, I think, on the Friday right before Rosh Hashanah, and we focus on some of these stories by looking at some modern Israeli poems about these stories and these moments. Anyways, so that's sort of an overview of the parsha. What we're going to focus on today is not, excuse me, not any one of these stories specifically, but some of the seams between the stories. And we're going to look at a particular phrase that appears 5 times in Breshit, but twice in this parsha, and take a look at when the rabbis and commentators of the Torah see this phrase, how they use it to weave stories together in interesting ways. And it'll give us an insight to how the rabbis of the days of the Talmud looked at some of the stories in this parsha and what they added to our read and understanding of it. All right, I'm going to share my screen and start this slideshow. Here we go. So the phrase we're going to focus on is the following: Vayahi achar hadvarim ha'ela, which in contemporary English translations is often translated something like sometime afterward. And as a literary device, this phrase has a function. If you're reading the Torah, it sort of seems to say the last story closed and some time has passed before this next story begins, right? We see this sometimes in movies or television show. Also, the screen goes black and some words come up and say, 3 months later or 6 months later or 12 years later or something. When the Torah uses this phrase, it doesn't tell us how long has passed, but the literary commentators of the Torah seem to suggest that this means a significant time has passed between the last story. It's not like the next day the sun came up and here's what happened, but between what happened before, some time has passed and now something new happens. But the rabbis look at this a little more literally, which gives them an opening for midrashic interpretation. Right, the word, so Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'ela, the word dvarim, right, says really a more literal translation would be after these things. So something happened, and after these things happen, something new is going to happen. But the word for things in Hebrew, dvarim, is also the word for words. So this phrase could mean after these words. Now, linguistically, I like that connection that Hebrew makes between words and things. I like that because, right, if thinking about nouns in particular, but I guess it's true of all words, right? Each word represents a thing. Noun specifically, person, place, or thing. But I guess adjectives a different kind of thing, right? A descriptive thing. Language in part takes things and gives a word to them. So Hebrew draws our attention to the correspondence between words and things by having the word dvarim mean both things. Pardon me if I have a little bit of losing my voice today. I'm sorry about that. All right, wet my whistle. Hopefully that'll help. The rabbis see this and they interpret this a little more literally and ask a question: what specific words is this phrase referring to? Meaning, when it says after these words, this next thing happened, they're going to ask the question: what are the words that led to the next thing happening? And in this week's parsha, we see it twice, and it happens. The two occurrences of this phrase bookend the story of the Akedah. The beginning of the story of the binding of Isaac, chapter 22 of Genesis, starts with the phrase, Vayhi achar dvarim ha'ela. sometime afterwards, God put Abraham to the test. And then there's the story of the binding of Isaac and Abraham. And then at the end of the story, right after, it says, sometime afterward, Abraham was told, Milcah too has borne a child to your brother Nahor. We'll come back to the context of that at the end, but afterwards we learn, after the Akedah story is over and it says Abraham and Isaac went home, the next thing is sometime afterward, Abraham is told about that his family has expanded and his family back from across the ancient Near East where he came from, his relatives have had more children and the generations have continued there. We're going to circle back to what that means in a minute. But in both of these cases, the rabbis read this not as sometimes afterwards, but as after these words, and they ask, which words led this to happen? And they bring some midrash to explain what that is. So midrash, I would say, is a rabbinic mode of interpreting Torah, and it's a way of adding a new lens to the text. It's a way of reading into the text something that's not there that changes how we understand what the text says. And for the first phrase, sometime after these words, God put Abraham to the test, the rabbis are going to offer two possible explanations about what happened. And they start with this question, what are these words? So Rashi, it happens, brings, I drew the commentary from Rashi, although the first thing we're going to see comes from the Talmud. Rashi quotes it from there, and the second one from Midrash, but both are rabbinic commentaries. And goes like this. So about after these things or words, Rashi says, some of our rabbis say that this means after the words of Satan, the Satan, right, God's adversary in the heavenly court, who denounced Abraham, saying, of all the banquets which Abraham has prepared, not a single bullock nor a single ram did he bring as a sacrifice to you. This echoes, if you know the book of Job, where Satan sort of needles God and says, the book of Job, right? Job, your most devoted person. Well, he's had a good life. You can't test a person's devotion to you, God, by whether or not they have a good life. And then God strikes calamity on Job. And there's another story there. This echoes this and says, Satan says to God, Abraham's had gotten so much from you. He's a wealthy person. He's lived a good life, but he hasn't given you a single offering in return. And what does God say in reply? God says, does he do anything at all except for his son's sake? Yet if I were to bid him sacrifice him to me, he would not refuse. God takes Satan's bait and says, Abraham's life revolves around his son, but I can show you how grateful Abraham is to me. I will ask him. He hasn't given me an offering, but I'm going to ask him for an offering of his son, and he's not going to refuse. So on a literal level, right, it says, after these words, God tests Abraham. Some ways this midrash comes to say, answer the question, well, what words? These are the words. Satan and God had a conversation in heaven or wherever they hang out. The corner, maybe, the corner bar in heaven or in the heavenly court or whatever that is. And Satan teases God. God responds by saying, I'll show you. I'm going to prove to you Abraham is indeed grateful. Now, well, on one hand, this is answering the question, what were the words that Vayi Achar Dvarim Ha'ela is referring to? I think it's really answering another question also. It's saying, it's dealing with the fact that the story of the binding of Isaac is a difficult one, right? How can God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son? And this is meant to show one perspective from the rabbis that says, well, here's why God did this. It's not that God did it randomly. God did it to defend Abraham against the attacks of Satan. I don't know about you, while this maybe adds some context in a way of reading the story, not sure this is any less problematic because it shows maybe God being weaker of character. Not a test of Abraham that we don't understand because the Bible is silent, but a test of Abraham in response to some teasing or needling or ribbing from Satan. But that's what this midrash presents. Um, the rabbis and Rashi also bring a second option. They say, Rashi tells us, others say, what does it mean after these words? After the words of Ishmael, who boasted to Isaac that he had been circumcised when he was 13 years old without resisting. So a different teasing, but now Ishmael is teasing Isaac. Ishmael says, Isaac, you were circumcised at 8. You can't, you're a baby, you don't feel it. No big deal to get circumcised at 8. When I was circumcised, I was 13, and I did it, without resisting. I was willingly ready to go through circumcision and the pain of it. Somehow that makes me better than you. A little sibling rivalry. And in response to Ishmael's words, what does Isaac say? Isaac says, you think to intimidate me by mentioning the loss of one part of the body? If God, blessed be he, were to tell me, sacrifice yourself to me, I would not refuse. This midrash takes a different spin. Also trying to say what words are the words that led to the story of the Akedah, whereas the first story places it, the reason for the Akedah is God responding to Satan's teasing of God's self. Here, Ishmael is teasing Isaac, and Isaac makes a boast. Isaac makes a boast saying, you think you're so great, older brother Ishmael, that you got circumcised at 13 and that makes you tougher? You just lost a small part of your body. If God were to ask me for my whole self to be sacrificed to God, I would surely say yes. And in response to Isaac's words, God jumps in and tests Abraham. Paints a different picture of the story to come, that Isaac is a willing participant in this to show his dedication to God in response to the teasing of his brother Ishmael, as opposed to God responding to the teasing of Satan. Two different takes on what that story means and where the story comes from. Now, each of these are problematic in their own sense. None of them sort of say like, well, kids teach each other and boast all the time, and I hope that God doesn't step in every time one of my kids makes a boast that maybe is a little too big for themselves and holds it to them literally. But the second midrash does take a different view on the story, that Isaac is a willing participant as opposed to an innocent victim, and might color how we read the story. So those are the two midrashim here about this. And now I'm going to jump to the end of the story. Let me go back to the verse I showed you at the beginning that says, after Isaac is saved and the ram is sacrificed and they go back home, it says, verse 22, sometime afterwards, Abraham was told, Milcah has borne children to your brother Nahor, right? His family that stayed in Ur Kasdim, his family that stayed across, that didn't travel with them to the land of Israel, has had more children. And part of this genealogy mentions the birth of Rebecca, who we know in the coming story in next week's Parsha, sorry, spoiler alert, Rebecca, right, Abraham's going to send his servant across the ancient Near East to find a life partner for Isaac. And this sort of foreshadows that Rebecca's born and that she's going to be a character in the story. Well, this says Abraham hears that there are children there, and he sends his servant back to the family to find a maid, and Rebecca becomes that person. The rabbis use a similar midrashic technique because it's the same phrase here at the end of chapter 22. What are the words that were said that led this story to be introduced into the text? Excuse me again. And here's the midrash this time. When Abraham, returned from Mount Moriah, Abraham was pondering, and he said, if my son had really been slain, he would have died without children. So I must marry him off to one of the daughters of Aner, Eshcol, or Mamre. Right? Abraham, who much of his story up to this time is about how the covenant will be passed on from him to the next generation, where there is no next generation. And in this week's Parsha, Ishmael is sent from his house, and Isaac potentially would have been slain on Mount Moriah. And Abraham realizes, well, now he has a child, but he doesn't have grandchildren yet. And his worry is now not just about the next generation, but the one after that. So he feels pressure to marry Isaac and says he's going to look to find Isaac a mate from the tribes that live around him. God, therefore, says the Midrash, had this announcement made to him, Abraham, that Rebekah, the one who was fit, says the Midrash, to be Isaac's consort, that she had been born. And this is what's meant after these things are words, meaning words here. These express the thoughts aroused by the binding of Isaac, right? So the words here are, after the binding of Isaac, Abraham becomes concerned about the renewed death experience of his son, wants to make sure he has grandchildren. And he says these words to himself, oh, I have to get Isaac married. And in response to that, in response to those words, what becomes important for God is there to step in and make sure the information that the family back home has also had new generations, and perhaps he doesn't have to look locally for a spouse for his son. He can look for a spouse from the clan, from the kin, right back at home. And so why is there this little story between the Akedah and what follows next week, the death of Sarah, and then Abraham sending out to get a spouse for Isaac? And why look far? Well, because he heard that his family has a new child. And here this Midrash comes to answer the question, right? What are these verses doing at the end of the Akedah story? They seem to be out of place. Now, literarily speaking, we might say it's foreshadowing information that you need to know to make sense of the next story. But the Midrash comes to say it's actually not just foreshadowing for us, but it's a way for God to direct what's happening in the earthly world and make sure Abraham sends his servant far back to where his family is from and not near to where these other tribes are. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and come back to you. I guess you can still see me on your little screen, but now I'll be able to see you. All right. Anyways, to sum up this little piece, and then we'll see. I see, oh my God, 75 comments in the chat. I was not able to follow all of those while we were going. And I can tell you in the minutes we have left, we will not be able to deal with all 75. But what I love about the chat and Zoom that I've learned, both as a teacher and participant, it's its own piece of the conversation to engage in the chat. What I hope to do today is to show you like how rabbis take advantage of different seams in the text to add different interpretation, different readings of the story. And here they take advantage of this literary device, this phrase, after these things or words. And each of the 5 times in Torah, and actually the 9 times in the Bible as a whole where it comes up, there are midrashim that say which words, right? It's a part of their midrashic reading. And what each of their answers to it do, on the one hand, you could say answers the question, which words? These words. But really, each of these midrashim answer quite a different question about the text. One is, what's going on in this Akedah? The Akedah story is hard. Maybe we can have a new insight into it by interpreting this phrase, or to try to solve the mystery of what's this genealogy doing at the end of chapter 2. Anyways, let me pause here. I saw, Joanne, did you have your hand up? Joanne S.? Oh, I don't know if you're able to unmute. We can make that happen, I think. Can I make that happen? Let me see.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm so revved up about this dialogue between Hashem and Satan. It's such a game changer in my experience of Torah. And alongside that, I have a really long love story around Dvarim being words and things. There's so much mileage there. But what struck me in your teaching this morning was it seems to be sort of a description about how we experience time. That Satan shows up and says, hey, get rid of your son right now. And Hashem kind of shifts more into eternity. That the covenant is not just for time as we know it in our lives. The covenant is not so egocentric as to be, this is such a terrible thing to say, throw the baby out with the bathwater. But it's more long lasting. So this is all the things I'm tripping on, but here's my question.
Sure.
What does this expression, my whole self, mean? My notes are not, sacrifice yourself to me, I would not refuse. So like, it seems so risky to believe that my whole self is hearing something, like from whom? So is there anything about that, my whole self?
So first of all, thank you for your reading of this text. And I like that. I love your appreciation of the Midrashim as well. I think, one of the things I love about not just being in the world of Torah, but then being in the rabbi's world of Torah is there are all different ways to read the text. I love that you called out this piece like my whole self. Right, because Yishmael's boast is like, I just gave up. I was circumcised as 13, and Isaac's saying, you just gave up your foreskin. I'm prepared to sacrifice whole self. There's a way to read that, I think, just whole body, like physical, as opposed to one part, all. But I think, especially the way you said it, I love how you embodied it right there in your voice. The whole self could mean not just body, but spirit, soul, more than that. And read that way, it's where if you were with us, when we read the poetry about this, I don't know, a month ago before Rosh Hashanah, some of the poem looked at Isaac as a victim here, as Isaac as a victim of God's challenge and Abraham's action. But this midrash says, wasn't just it was a test of Abraham, but Isaac was prepared for it. And that's a whole different read of the story. To me, it's a powerful one to think about. Anyways,
I
thanks.
guess as you were speaking, it dawned on me that whole, shalem, is also peace. Yeah. And maybe when we trust what we quote unquote hear from Hashem, it's when it lands on us with peace.
Yeah. Well, that's another great Hebrew connection, the connection between wholeness and peace. I could say, I don't, in a time when we don't have peace, I definitely feel the brokenness of it. But thank you for calling that out too. Thanks, Joanne. Jack, I see you have your hand up too.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
The Akedah has always interested me, and the more I study, the more I realize Torahs have many meanings. Akedah means the binding of Isaac. And every time you see pictures of this, it's this little boy, really, he's about 38, 39 years old, goes with his father. But the title of the binding of Isaac, if this was just a test of Abraham, the question then comes in, why isn't it the test of Abraham? At this point, the binding of Isaac to me is Isaac at 38, his father is about 120, like 130 or whatever, is that Isaac then becomes the patriarch. Abraham gets lost, marries Keturah, you don't hear from him again. Isaac becomes the patriarch at this point, and the binding of Isaac to me is the binding of Isaac to God, which is the second meaning of the Akedah, beside the fact that we don't believe in child sacrifice, etc.
Nice. I like that you called that out, right? A lot of times when we read this story, we think about what's happening with Abraham, but yet we call it the binding of Isaac. Jack, what your comment did was put Isaac in the center. It is a transitional story. There's a little bit of Abraham's story left, and Isaac's, stepping into, the Isaac saga starts. There's what to be said about, I want to take from the next week's conversations about as Isaac steps into it, how active is he? There's lots written about, how maybe this experience was so scarring on Isaac. He's the least active of the other patriarchs, and might have his own trauma that he's dealing with in what goes forward. But yes, I like this notion that some of this, the binding of Isaac, there's a literal piece of here, but it's also maybe the binding of Isaac to God. And this midrash, the second midrash that Rashi brought about this story, puts Isaac at the center as being willing, right? Stepping into the covenant, right? I'm ready to give everything to God. That's how they're bound together. And ultimately, while, he proves his willingness to be sacrificed, God doesn't let it go that far. And God and Isaac continue with, a covenant between them, which will occupy us in the weeks to come. Thank you for that, Jack. All right, I see that the chat is moving faster than I can follow it, which is awesome. There's some great Torah this week to talk about. I'm glad so many people are speaking to it. Mara, I don't know if you've been able to follow to call
yes
back to something.
Okay, well, I see Tanya's hands now raised. Oh, and now it's not. We'll come back to you, Tanya. Someone in the chat, I believe it was Paula early on, I think it was the first Rashi that you were looking at, was saying, why would we even care? Why would God even care what Satan thinks? Why is that playing into any of God's thoughts or actions?
Yeah. I love that question. It's a question about this midrash. It's my question also about not just mine, other people's too, about the book of Job. And I don't have a definitive answer for that. Here's what I would say, though. We each in our own way have our own understanding of what God is, of who God is, of how we, what we believe in God. And sometimes we, those come from our experiences of learning, our experiences of Torah, but sometimes we assume that our images, our beliefs of God, like reflect back in everything that happened, in our tradition, all the way back to the beginning of time. But actually, Judaism, Jewish tradition, even in its most ancient of times, has many different images of God, and they don't always line up with how we tend to think about God today. This midrash shows a particular image of God. It's a God who has an ego, perhaps. It's a God who cares what the other, angelic, divine figures believe. It's a God who has, I know the rabbis talk about, we all have a Yetzirah Tov and Yetzirah Ra. We have a good inclination and an evil inclination, like those two little voices, right? The angel and the devil on our shoulders. I don't know, I think of Tom and Jerry cartoons when I think. For those of you who watch Tom and Jerry cartoons when you were younger. But somehow this midrash paints this picture that God has this voice in God's head, or a voice of another figure in the heavenly court who says things that bother God, and God goes off into, God's playground of the world to prove to the Satan that the Satan is wrong and God is right. And sometimes in doing that, what happens with that to humans is not so great for the humans. Now, that's not such a comforting, for me anyways, perspective on God. It's also not, it's potentially an answer that says, why do crazy bad things happen in the world that we can't explain? Well, might be that God has God's reasons and we don't know, and something's going on behind the scenes. Like, here's an example of it. That's also not so compelling for me personally, because I don't want, the God I believe in isn't as fickle as the God in this midrash. And it's actually why the second midrash is more compelling for me than the first one. But it does raise this question, what's God's investment in the world? How secure is God in God's self? Does God have human foibles, personality. And this midrash suggests maybe God does. Not how we're used to thinking about God, but this midrash depicts that. So I love the question that was asked. Why would God care? And as readers of midrashim, we could say, this God doesn't speak to me. This midrash doesn't speak to me. I'm going to look for other ones. Some people might read this and say, I love stories in the Torah and midrashim, where we think about God differently for how I'm used to thinking about God, because it opens up new possibilities to me. And really, then I put the question back to you. Well, why would God care about what Satan says to God? That's a great midrashic question. So you can write the midrash on the midrash that tries to answer that, if it so compels you. Anyways, that's my answer to that question. Thank you for that. I love bringing up the theology in here. All right, Arnold.
Yeah, just in relation to that, I've always felt that when we read the Torah, we're reading about the evolution of a people. But I think, to me, it's always been the evolution of God. God changes. God, just because he created this world doesn't means he knows everything. And I think he learns about people. And I think he puts them to tests. And then he gets this, then he kills them all and says, oh, I shouldn't do that. So I think he's learning a great deal. Or God is, I won't say he. God is learning a great deal throughout these stories. And I think that makes it so much more interesting to me.
Yeah, thank you for that, Arnold. It resonates with me because a lot of times the Torah is one of the formative narratives of the Jewish people, about the Jewish people. But I also agree with you. The Torah is a narrative it's God's narrative, meaning, I'm going to say this with the literary language, right? The character of God in the Torah learns and grows and develops, and we can learn a lot about our ancient ancestors, about watching that journey. That lets me, if you've been here with me in the MJL Zoom space, you've heard me probably mention this book before. I love Jack Miles's book called God, a Biography. It's an analysis of the character of God in the Bible. And besides loving the book, it won the Pulitzer Prize, which, someone voted for it saying it's a good book. I like it too. But what I love for all of time, the Pulitzer Prize for this, because it didn't win the Pulitzer Prize in religious studies. It won the Pulitzer Prize for biography. It's called God, the Biography. And so it was worthy of a Pulitzer Prize. But the fact that it won in the biography column shows that the Pulitzers have a little bit of a sense of humor and also got what Jack Miles was trying to do. But if what Arnold said resonated with you, it's worth checking out, because there's a lot to learn from how God learns, grows, changes, evolves in the Bible, and what that says about the Bible, and what that says about Judaism, what that says about us. Andrea, please. I see your hand is up. Oh, nope. Andrea's gone. All right, Tanya, did you have your hand went up and then down? Did you have a question, Tanya? Oh, Andrea's back. You'll be next, Andrea. Oh.
Does Tanya have her hand up? I'm sorry, I don't see Tanya.
No, she did, and then she put it down. Well, she has her physical hand up. Do you know, Tanya, do you know where the hand button is of the reactions? Oh, there
Okay,
you go. Now we can find you. When you're in the middle of the 100 people on Zoom, it's sometimes hard to find the one little box. All right.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Tanya.
Is it my turn? Okay, Rabbi, I have a question about circumcision. When Ishmael was circumcised, and also Abraham's other servants were circumcised when God told him to be circumcised, did that make them Jews, or did that just elevate their status? is allowing them to participate in things as such as the Shabbat. What did that circumcision mean, since Isaac was not, Ishmael was not the covenant child? Did that mean he was actually Jewish and he got off somewhere later in life? What did that mean for Ishmael?
Right. Thank you for that question. Right. The symbol of circumcision is meant to be a symbol of the covenant. And you notice, right, it's not just Abraham and his family, it's the whole household that does it. In these stories in Genesis, there's a patriarchal society, not just about the patriarchs, but I think the household took on the religion of the head of household. And you raise an interesting thing, because first, I think Abraham's servants were part of, to say, did it make them Jewish? Like the whole term Jewish and the way we mean it is much, the word Jewish doesn't, the term Jewish doesn't appear till later. These are the, pre-Israelites and Abraham's family. So are the servants and their families part of the patriarchal families and part of those who go down with Jacob as a family to Egypt and become part of the Jewish people? Hard to say in the biblical narrative if the others in the household were part. They seem to have a status as part of the family, although the Torah is laser focused on the nuclear family and not these other people. And the Ishmael story, of course, is complicated because he gets sent away. And also, right, in Muslim tradition, right, in the Muslim story is that Ishmael is about, it's the binding of Ishmael. Like there's a whole different tradition about how the covenant goes from Abraham to Ishmael. So in the Muslim religion, right, it gets passed down where circumcision is done for everybody at 13, well, for men at 13, following these same stories. So how it happens over time, some of this changes. But I love that question. Are the members of Abraham's household part of the covenant? There's a way I think yes, and a way I think no, based on, I don't mean that like I'm decreeing. I think based on what the Torah is presenting. So
But
thanks.
Rabbi, one real quick comment. I was doing some research, and in the South, there were Jewish slave owners, and their slaves learned to keep Shabbat, and their slaves learned how to slaughter the meat according to the laws of kashrut. And it was really interesting. After slavery for generations, these pockets of former Negro slaves continued these customs. And I just thought that was really interesting. And they do identify as Jewish.
Oh, that's so interesting. I'm not, that's not a piece of American history that I know so much about, but I like, that's an interesting connection. I would say we should check in, like there's more to explore there. And for me too, thank you for giving me something to go research a little bit. All right, we're near the end of time. Andrew, you were away, you got called and then you lost the connection for a second. So if you can do your question quick, I'm happy to stay, but knowing that people have a hard stop at 11:15, we're at that 11:15.
I just wanted to comment on what somebody said before, but I'd love to have a link to what Tanya just said. That's fascinating. But I wanted to, I raised my hand when someone said, and you agreed with, that God changes throughout the Torah. And I think that's one reading, but I think a better reading is that our understanding of God changes throughout the Torah, that we're really limited. God describes things in terms of human senses, in terms of, smelling and feel, and we don't think God does that, but he's got to use words that we understand or we won't understand it. And so I think what changes is our perhaps maturity. I don't know, but our concept of what God is.
Nice. That's I embrace that comment. Right, my description of, if you look at the Torah, you could see God evolving. Another frame is to say, as humans evolve, the way in which we understand or describe God evolves. And that's, there's a theological question out there. And, is God's existence separate from humans or integral to humans? So, right, is God an idea that we've come to define that describes part of our experience, or is God this thing that we experience and then learn how to describe? And I'm happy to be on maybe for this moment on different sides of that question today with you, Andrea. Yeah, I like what you had to say. And
Can't describe and just try.
yeah. And there's that notion that God is God, and there's an eternal aspect about it, and it's the different ways we describe God is because we access the phenomenon of God in different ways and use different words. And so the change we might see in the Torah might reflect human change, right? Not as Jack Miles would say, the development of the character of the book. Nice. That's a great place to end on. Thanks everybody for amazing Torah study. I'm gonna have to read this chat afterwards. It's like exploding. You guys are awesome. I saw a few people saying, you hope my throat gets better. I appreciate that too. I like the thank yous, but